With the war in Ukraine intensifying, many European countries are beginning to increase their defense budget, signaling a paradigm shift from political liberalism to realism. Some political analysts also argue that the very nature of war could also be explained by realism. So, what is political realism in international relations? Let's find out with PAA. Hi, I'm Xiaoche Lo. Welcome to What People Also Ask, where I search something seemingly obvious and share with you some of its part, aka People Also Ask, which is a feature telling you what other people are searching on Google that relate to your query. Today's keyword is political realism. We will talk about what it is, its basic assumptions, principles, and critiques. So, what does realism mean in international relations? According to an article published on the official website of Mount Holyoke College, which is a private liberal art college in South Hadley, Massachusetts, realism is an approach to the study and practice of international politics. It emphasizes the role of the nations and makes a broad assumption that all nations are motivated by national interest, or at best, national interest disguised as moral concern. According to Wikipedia's realism entry and an article titled Introducing Realism in International Relations Theory published on International Relations, which is an open access website covering international relations and international politics, realism encompasses a range of concepts that seems to be centered around a few fundamental assumptions. These assumptions are 1. State-centrism. The first assumption of realism is that a nation is the principal actor in international relations. Other bodies exist, such as individual or organization, but their powers is limited. 2. Nation lives in a context of an anarchy. The international politics system is anarchic, as there is no supranational authority to enforce rules. The often used analogy of there being no one to call in an international emergency might help to underline this point. Within our own country, we typically have police forces, military courts, and so on. There is an expectation that this institution would do something in the event of emergency. However, there is no clear expectation of anyone or anything do something on a global scale, because there is no defined hierarchy. As a result, nations can only rely on themselves in the end. 3. Rationality and egoism. Decision makers are rational actors in the sense that rational decision-making leads to the pursuit of the national interest, and the nation act in their national self-interest within the international system. 4. Power politic. Realists believe world politics is always and necessarily a field of conflict among nations pursuing wealth and power, and nations desire power to ensure self-preservation. Realists believe that there are no universal principles that can be used to guide the behavior of all nations. Instead, a nation must be constantly aware of the acts of its neighboring countries and take a pragmatic approach to resolve problems as they emerge. A lack of trust in each other's motives leads to mistrust and competition between nations. Realism does not favor any particular moral philosophy, nor does it consider ideology to be a major factor in the behavior of nations. However, realists are generally critical of liberal foreign policy, which we will discuss later in this video. Some figures frequently cited as realists including Thucydides, Niccolo Machiavelli, Thomas Hobbes, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Max Weber. So, what are some examples of realism? The aforementioned article published on International Relations provides some examples explaining international relations with realism. One example is the relationship between US and the Soviet Union during World War II and Cold War. During World War II in 1939 to 1945, the United States and the Soviet Union were allies because they both perceived a rising Germany as a threat and tried to balance it. However, within a few years after the war's end, the nations had become bitter enemies, and the balance of power began to change once more when new allies were formed during the Cold War. Another example is the conflict between the West Arabic countries and the Islamic State group. The article argues that nations count on self-help for guaranteeing their own security. Within this context, realists have two main strategies for managing insecurity: the balance of powers and deterrence. Deterrence relies on the threat or use of substantial force, whereas the balance of powers relies on strategic, flexible alliances. In this example, both are in evidence. The United States, Russia, and France relies on a variety of fair weather alliances with regional powers like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. And deterring the enemy with overwhelming superior force or the prospect of doing so was seen as the quickest way to reclaim control of the Islamic State-controlled territory. On the other hand, from the realistic point of view, the Islamic State organization is utilizing a few resources at its disposal to offset Western influence in the Iraq and Syria by spreading terror. Because first, it would exacerbate anti-Western sentiment in the Middle East by making the local inhabitants the target of foreign attacks. Second, the sense of injustice fostered by this assault allows for the spontaneous recruitment of militants eager to die to further the group's objectives. This is true both for individuals in the immediate region and for those who are exposed to the Islamic State propaganda on the internet. Realists often argue that realism is called realism for a reason, since it's more realistic and seems to be a more reliable model to describe, explain, and predict events in international relations. Or is it? So, what are some critiques of political realism? It should come as no one surprise that political realism receives a number of academic critiques. I have compiled a list of major critiques of political realism from PAA article as follows. 1. Encourage war and conflict. Realist critics argue that realists can perpetuate the violent and confrontational world that they describe. By assuming the uncooperative and egoistic natures of humankind and the absence of hierarchy in the state system, realists encourage leaders to act in the ways based on suspicions, powers, and force. As a result, realism might be viewed as a self-fulfilling prophecy. Realists, on the other hand, believe that leaders face endless constraints and limited opportunities for cooperation. As a result, they have few alternatives for escaping the reality of power politics. For realists, facing reality of one's situation is prudent and rational. Realists also often argue that realism actually encourages the leader to be extremely cautious when deciding where and when to use military power, and only use it when it serves your national interest. For example, the US invasion of Iraq in 2003, undertaken as part of the global war on terror, was opposed by most leading realists in US as a misuse of power that would not serve the US national interest. 2. Democratic peace theory. Democratic peace theory claims that realism does not apply to democratic state-to-state relations because studies show that democratic states do not go to war with one another. Realists and the proponents of other schools, on the other hand, criticize both the claims and the study that appear to back it up, claiming that the definition of war and democracy need to be tweaked to achieve the desired result to support democratic peace theory. 3. Inconsistent with non-European politics. Scholars have argued that realist theories, particularly realist conceptions of anarchy and power balance, have not characterized East Asian and African international relations. 4. State-centrism. Realist theories of international relations have been criticized for assuming that nations are fixed and unitary units. One analogy is that it seems states a solid pool ball bouncing around the table, never pausing and examine what is inside each one and why it moves the way it does. 5. Fail to predict or explain the more recent transformation of international systems. The conclusion of Cold War between the United States of America and Soviet Union in 1991 is one such example. With the Cold War ended, international politics shifts quickly, pointing to a new period of less competition and significant potential for cooperation. As a result of this transition, an optimistic vision of international politics emerged, dismissing realism as old thinking. 6. Associate with appeasement. It might sound weird that a series focusing on the competing nature of international relations is associated with appeasement, but remember I mentioned earlier, realism actually encourages the leader to only use military force when it serves the national interest, and generally oppose liberal interventionism, an idea proposed that liberal international organizations or nations can intervene in other nations in order to pursue liberal objectives. As a result, in mid-20th century, realism was seen as discredited in the United Kingdom due to its association with appeasement in the 1930s. It re-emerged slowly during the Cold War. So since we mentioned liberalism, I think it's a good time to talk about it as opposing theories of realism. So what are the differences between realism and liberalism in international relations? According to Wikipedia's entries of liberalism, international liberalism is a school of thought in international relations theory that based on three ideas. 1. Echoing to Christian realism security/warfare foundations by rejecting power politic in international relations. 2. Emphasize mutual benefit and international cooperation. 3. Recognize the role of international organizations and non-governmental actors in shaping states' preferences and political choices. Supporters of liberalism often believe in the spreading of democracy through cooperation. However, a more radical form of liberal interventionism believes liberal international organizations or countries can intervene in other states in order to pursue liberal objectives, sometimes even through military intervention. International liberalism sounds like a good idea in general. After all, who doesn't want to live in a world where all countries are democratized as well as living peacefully, cooperating, and prospering together? Some argue, however, that international liberalism, especially liberal interventionism, might be a form of idealism that fails to recognize the reality of power politics. And if decision makers make decisions solely based on liberalism, it could lead to many unintended consequences. One article published on foreign policy titled "The World Wants You to Think Like a Realist," written by Stephen Walls, who is an American political scientist at Harvard University, argues that if you think like a realist, many confusing aspects of the world politics will become easier to understand. And if you think like a realist, you are more likely to act with a degree of prudence, and you will less likely to see opponents as purely evil or see your own countries as wholly virtuous, and less likely to embark on open-ended moral crusade. And he argues, ironically, if more people thought like realists, the prospect for peace would actually go up. I do not 100% agree with his idea, but I highly recommend reading this article. I will put a link in the description. Okay, let's recap. Today we learned what is realism in international relations, some examples and critiques of realism, as well as its comparison with opposing theories of liberalism. If you made it to the end of the video, chances are that you enjoy learning what people also ask on Google. But let's face it, reading PAA yourself will be a pain. So here's the deal, I will do the reading for you and upload a video compiling some fun PAA once a week. All you have to do is to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you won't miss any PAA report that I compile. So just do it right now. Bye!